Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and welcome to the 8th weekly HWbot score roundup. I do apologize for this one being so incredibly late, but it's here now, and there was a lot of awesome scores posted to HWbot last week. So let's just jump right into it because there is quite a few scores to get through. So starting off with Bisso's 3Dmark Port Royal world record using two RTX 3090 Kingpin editions on liquid nitrogen, of course. How did that happen? Anyway, on liquid nitrogen, of course, running 2790 megahertz on the core, 1444 megahertz on the memory, and beating the previous 3Dmark Port Royal world record by over 2,000 points. So that is quite the increase. Like the previous record is right here. That's quite the improvement on the previous top score. And most of that seems to just come down to the memory clock that Bisso is able to push his 3090 KPE cards to. Because OGS was actually running a higher core clock on their their cards when they were for their 3Dmark Port Royal record. But from what I've heard, Port Royal being a ray tracing workload and with the core clock being so incredibly high, the bandwidth requirements on the 3090 actually get really kind of ridiculous, and so you end up being very memory limited in this benchmark with these kinds of core clocks. Because the thing is, like, the memory only needs to be as fast as the rate at which the GPU core is capable of processing data. So if the GPU core is capable of processing, a terabyte of data every second, and your memory can't keep up with that, then you've got a bottleneck. Otherwise, it just kind of, like, you can still have some performance gains from constantly pushing the memory further, but it's not, you're not going to see situations like we see right here where, 100, slightly more than 100 megahertz more memory clock translates to a absolutely massive score increase, even though the cards are actually running at lower core clocks, because the cards in when OGS ran their 3Dmark Port Royal, they were obviously extremely memory bottlenecked. So that core clock, basically there was a lot of clock cycles on that GPU where the GPU was kind of just sitting there waiting for memory to get around to delivering data. So yeah, the rest of Bisso's system was a 10900K with no hyperthreading, running 5.4 gigahertz, and dual rank G-Skill Samsung B-Die at 4400 CL17. So not exactly the pinnacle of CPU performance, but the thing is, Port Royal is not a CPU benchmark, it's a GPU benchmark, and unlike some of the older 3Dmarks, it doesn't even have like a CPU test component, so that in my opinion makes it a really nice GPU benchmark, because you can really just focus on maxing out the GPUs to the best of your ability, instead of also having to mess around with like CPU settings a lot. So yeah, motherboard used was a Maximus 13 Apex, and congratulations to Bisso on the 3Dmark Port Royal world record. And let's move on to the next score, which is another world record, this time in PC Mark 10 Express. Now, unfortunately, this is a benchmark I know very little about. I believe it does some video encoding stuff and some storage stuff. Anyway, Mike CDM here took the world record in PC Mark 10 Express with an 11900K pushing 6.45 gigahertz on liquid nitrogen on a ASRock Z590 OC Formula motherboard. Memory tuned for memory latency rather than memory bandwidth. So just what is that? That's like 3760, 1211, 1128, 1T command rate. So synchronized, like gear 1 memory mode, uncore of 5.64 gigahertz, RX 580 doing 1550 megahertz on the core, which I guess that's for the video encoding component. Like, as far as I know, this shouldn't really be a GPU benchmark that would require a significant GPU overclock, but well, still, that RX 580 is absolutely flying. Yeah, so new world record. First person to break the 10,000 points barrier in this benchmark. The previous record was a 10900K doing 9,719 points. So yeah, a very, very solid result there from Mike CDM. Unfortunately, I just don't really know much about this benchmark. It's very new to the HWbot rankings as well, as I believe it only recently got points. And so yeah, I guess we're gonna see more top scores, come out for this benchmark soon-ish. The longer the scores are going to go up, the longer the benchmark sticks around. Like that's an inevitability of competitive overclocking. The scores will always get better, but some of them it takes longer than others. So yeah, still congratulations to Mike CDM on being the first person to break the 10,000 points barrier in PC Mark 10 Express. And let's move on to the next score, which is Tag's Y-Cruncher Pi 1 billion single core record using an Intel Xeon L3014. Now, this is an LGA 771 CPU, but you can apparently modify those to run on LGA 775 motherboards. So he's running it on a Rampage Extreme. This is the fastest single-core CPU ever made. Mostly because we don't make single-core CPUs anymore. They're not a thing. So it's a really old... Actually, there's also the Sempron 145, and... there's a single-core Sempron CPU that's also, it's either this Xeon or, a really good single-core Sempron. That's, your best single-core CPU ever, because we just don't make single cores anymore. These don't make any sense for modern computers, but... Anyway... Tag has an L3014, and he ran it on Cascade Phase Change for 19 minutes, well, probably longer than that, but the benchmark itself took 19 minutes and 12 seconds, 253 milliseconds, beating the previous record, which was also set on an L3014, of 20 minutes, 24 seconds, and 53 milliseconds by, over a minute. So a big improvement in the score there. And yeah, this was done on a Asus Rampage Extreme motherboard. These boards are actually notorious for having early Prodlyzer style capacitors, and actually Prodlysers in general don't have a great reputation for longevity, but especially the ones used on the Rampage Extreme and some other hardware from this era. Those things which fail short circuit. So if you have one of a Rampage Extreme and you have a shorted, well, in this case, Northbridge VRM, or I believe also the memory VRM has one. If Northbridge or memory is shorted out, it's probably because the the capacitor on it failed. And this is how you fix that: is you remove the old Prodlyzer capacitor and replace it with with a polymer and some ceramics. Also Northbridge on phase change cooling as well, and some Crucial Ballistics memory, 8 gigs of it, running 1800 88827 1T command rate. So I in terms of, I don't know if for DDR3 this doesn't look fast, but for LGA 775 it might be just a limitation of the capacity of the memory sticks, because I believe for Y-Cruncher you do need quite a bit of memory available. You might not be I don't think you can run it on just 4 gigs of RAM. And so, that'll obviously restrict what kinds of memory settings you can run, just in terms of what kind of memory chips are available in the appropriate capacities. And the 4 gigabit memory chips just generally aren't very good, is one of the ways you can look at it. And this would actually still be... a lot of the 2 gigabit memory chips aren't very good. When it comes to doing super low latencies at lower frequencies. They're generally they're really good at high frequencies. But yeah, so awesome score from Tag here for the L3014. I wish I knew more about LGA 775, but great score. Congratulations to Tag on the first place in a single core Y-Cruncher Pi 1 billion, and let's move on to the next score, which is Splav's GPU Pi for CPU 1 billion score using using an 8-core CPU, done with a Ryzen 7 5800X at 6.1 gigahertz. This is the fastest 5800X to ever run this benchmark. running it in 55 seconds, 712 milliseconds. Like, literally in terms of clock speed, this is the highest clocked 5800X ever for this benchmark. Yeah, beating the previous record by 200, like a little bit more than 200 milliseconds. The thing is, like, if 5800X versus 5800X, so this benchmark's pretty close to maxed out. Splave is supported by ASRock, so he's running an ASRock X570 Aqua. Dual rank G-Skill memory, so single rank sticks, but 4 of them, so that's a dual rank memory configuration running 3600, 14, 14, 14. So honestly, a GPU Pi is not a benchmark I run very much. But based on that, I'm guessing it doesn't really care that much about memory performance, or at least it favors core speed over memory speed, because with Ryzen, depending on what kind of, depending on the CPU, you're often going to be trading core clock for memory clock, because the memory controller gets worse the colder the chip gets. Or, there might be a temperature at which the memory controller works okay, but generally the core just wants to be at the lowest possible temperature no matter what. So a lot of the time you'll be trading memory performance for core clock. And so I'm assuming, and so based on the fact that these memory settings right here aren't really, that fast by DDR, they just really aren't by DDR4 memory overclocking standards. I'm guessing GPU Pi just really does prefer core speed. Also, with Ryzen, you do have a lot of L3 cache to go around, so basically, it's honest, if the benchmark there should be a lot of benchmarks where the memory speed doesn't matter that much. I mean, look at Cinebench, right? Like, Cinebench on Ryzen really doesn't care about memory speed much at all. Yeah. Awesome score from Splave, but that's kind of what he does. Like, he's had, I believe, the 5800X top score in GPU Pi for CPU in the past. He has a bunch of other top scores with the 5800X as well. So, not really surprising to see him at the top of the rankings for yet another 5800, yet another 8-core benchmark, but nonetheless, congratulations to him on the first place in GPU Pi for CPU 1 billion. And let's move on to the next score, which is also from Splave, his 3Dmark Firestrike Extreme, second place using a RX 6900 XT OC formula on chilled water cooling. And not super chilled, it's just like 12 degrees, so that's not like you can get chillers that'll take water cooling all the way down to like minus 20 degrees. At that point, it's debatable how much water is in the loop, but you can certainly get very, very, very cold on like chilled loops of various fluids. Some of them heavily based on water, some of them more antifreeze than water, but yeah, in this case, this is actually just regular water. As 12 degrees idle, you don't really have to worry about anything other than condensation, so no need for any like antifreeze type thing going on. Single stage phase change on the 5950X, doing 5.2 gigahertz on that. And yeah, card absolutely flying with, it's not really visible in the screenshot here properly, so it's better if we check out the actual 3Dmark results. Averaging over 3 gigahertz core clock throughout the test. Which is quite insane considering that the card is it's still technically above 0, right? Yeah, it's colder than ambient, but still above 0. Using the Elmore Labs EVC2 for voltage control because, well, that's the best way to get voltage control on. I'd argue basically any card where you can use an EVC2, you should probably use the EVC2. It is way better than dealing with the, a lot of overclocking software is garbage as far as I'm concerned. So it's if I can use an EVC2 or some kind of tool that isn't dependent on the OS working properly, I'll use that before I'll go with the software. Anyway, also here's a picture of the actual setup of the card, just a CPU block. I'm pretty sure it's bolted to it, but yeah, you can't really see it too well, and then just fans for cooling everything else, because if you're running a short benchmark like Firestrike, the VRM and memory isn't going to overheat before the benchmark finishes. So, and also depending on the speed of your fan, the speed of the fans, you might actually be able to get away with it for almost indefinite amounts of runtime. So, Yeah, very impressive score from Splave, and I'm assuming he's eventually going to be taking the card on LN2, so I'm very interested to see what he manages to do with it when he gets around to that, because like this thing's already going over 3 gigahertz, and it's not even below 0, so thing is absolutely flying. And yeah, congratulations to Splave on the second place in Firestrike Extreme with that 6900 XTOC formula, and let's move on to the next score, which is Lumi's SuperPi 32 million with the 3770K at 7.13 gigahertz. Now, this is a very, very competitive like CPU ranking. There is a lot of people who have tried to take first place or at least get a good result in SuperPi 32 million using a 3770K. If we go over to 50 scores, so you can see that's 50 scores on LN2, that's 100 scores on LN2, 150 scores on LN2. It goes on, and just there's some cascade cooling systems over here, which cascades, depending on the cascade, those can go down to minus 100 or even less than that. So actually, I think I've heard of like a 4-stage cascade that actually ran liquid nitrogen as the final stage. So at that point, you could probably consider that LN2 as well. But yeah, so a lot of sub-zero 3770K scores, and so there's a lot of competition in this CPU ranking, and Lumi managed to get to the very top of it with just the highest clock 3770K to ever run the benchmark at 7.13 gigahertz. The next two scores down are at like 7.06. As you can see, 7.06, yeah. So highest clock, 3770K in this benchmark. Now, SuperPi 32M is a single-threaded benchmark, very memory intensive, but also it just loves core speed. So, yeah, the CPU is absolutely flying at that frequency. One core, one thread, because single-threaded benchmark. Windows XP, because SuperPi 32 million is one of those old benchmarks that just runs best on Windows XP. And then for the memory settings, I believe Lumi has actually made a video about benching this 3770K, so I'll include a link to that video down in the description. He has a YouTube channel. You should subscribe to him. He does a bunch of extreme overclocking stuff. Far more than I do. Like it runs a lot more liquid nitrogen than I do. But anyway, running DDR3 2500 696 timings, 1T command rate. I believe PSC memory for that, and memory on liquid nitrogen as well as the CPU. Maximus 5 Extreme motherboard for the motherboard. Is it the Extreme? Yeah, Maximus 5 Extreme motherboard. And also direct die for the LN2 pot mounting to the CPU. So yeah, and this is an appropriate amount of thermal paste for direct die applications. In fact, even if you're like a lot of these chips that have a IH, like a lot of the chips where you delid them to replace the thermal paste, if you're running them on liquid nitrogen, this is actually a totally good, like that's a good amount of thermal paste to use. Just completely fill the inside of the IHS, basically. It helps with reducing thermal paste cracking. It also helps with thermal transfer just because instead of having an air gap between the substrate and the IHS, or in this case LN2 pot, as you can see, he's not actually running. Like he's running the IHS as a mounting pressure bracket because the problem is if you just apply pressure to the center of the CPU, it'll warp the substrate upwards, and you'll start losing contact on the pins around the outside of the socket, which can lead to memory overclocking issues and all kinds of other problems. Like sometimes you can get it like if you put enough pressure on the center of the substrate, you can permanently damage the substrate. You can also end up in situations where it's just bent so much that you have so little contact that it won't even run properly. So the sort of that's actually a custom that's not like a stock IHS, that's a custom IHS that's been modified for direct die applications like this. So that's just acting as a mount, like pressure, like to hold the substrate down there, bracket to hold the substrate down. And yeah, and then you just fill it out with thermal paste because thermal paste instead of an air gap between the bottom of the LN2 pot and the substrate means that you can cool the substrate from with the LN2 pot more effectively. And that can lead to better like lower die temperatures, which means higher frequencies because well, that's chips clock higher the colder they are. It's really kind of that simple. Well, it's not actually that simple, but like with a lot of CPUs, the colder they get, the faster they can go. So, yeah. So a big part of like getting a score like this is just actually managing to get the CPU to those lowest temperatures and having the thermal paste actually survive. So yeah, congratulations to Lumi on the first place in the 3770K SuperPi 32 million category. Very difficult score to get first place in. And yeah, let's move on to the next score, which is another score from Lumi, this time on the Core i7-930 at 5.37 gigahertz, taking the record in W prime 32M for this CPU. Yeah, this is an old record. So the previous record for this CPU in W prime 32M is from 2011. So that's like a 10-year-old record that Lumi beat there, using a Asus Rampage 3 Black Edition. I believe Elpida hyper-based memory. Those are Corsair Dominator sticks. You can tell from the ridiculous heat. Yeah, those are Corsair Dominators. They came in with a few different heat spreaders. Those are the really, or more like heat spreader fins. But yeah, those are the really ridiculous heat spreader fins for those. Well, Dominator GTX 2s. Running, 2440 on the memory at 686. So just insanely tight memory timings. 1T command rate, of course, 4.6 gigahertz on-core. 4 cores, 8 threads, because W prime 32 million is a multi-threaded benchmark. It's an old benchmark that also likes Windows XP best. Yeah, this one's mostly, like, the memory obviously goes into it, but this is primarily a CPU benchmark. It's not, the thing is, it also depends sort of on the architecture of the CPU itself, whether it's going to be heavily memory limited or not. And not like, because there are certain CPUs where like say on Ryzen, Cinebench basically doesn't care about memory settings. On like Ryzen 5000, Cinebench doesn't care about memory settings. On say older Intel CPUs or even current gen Intel CPUs, Cinebench will actually show performance gains from memory overclocking. But so the same kind of thing applies to really any benchmark. It's not just the benchmark itself. It also kind of depends on the CPU architecture as to how sensitive it will be to memory tuning. But yeah, all around just epic, CPU on liquid nitrogen, of course, like this. Though it's interesting that like these old 900 series Core i7s they really don't clock very high, right? Like this is like 5.3, like yeah, even on liquid nitrogen they really do not clock very high, but still an awesome score from Lumi, right? Beating a very, very old record. Which just sort of goes to show you how that in a way is a measure of how difficult the score is to beat, because there are certainly many people who would attempt to be the first in a lot of these old CPU categories. So yeah, congratulations to Lumi on the i7-930 W prime 32M top score. And let's move on to the next score, which is Crazy 85's SuperPi 32 million on the Core i3 2120 on dry ice. And also, this is like the most aesthetically pleasing extreme overclocking system I've seen in a very long time. Like, look at it. It's like the LN2 pots match the motherboard. Like, what more could you ask for? But anyway, he's just running this on dry ice. Which does mean you can go kind of minimalist on the insulation. Personally, I don't really. I'm not a fan of the whole the memory sticks are covered in ice, so I'm not too concerned about those. But the thing is, there's like a memory power plane that tends to freeze through that. And we're not seeing, like, I'm surprised there's not frost buildup on those capacitors. Like, that's not really, yeah. So seeing the actually, it should be down around here. Oh, maybe with this motherboard layout, it actually doesn't work out too badly. But if you have the memory VRM over here, it has a tendency to freeze over because there's like a memory power plane that goes right down the middle of the memory sticks and towards the CPU. And so if the memory sticks are cold, that'll freeze through, and then your memory VRM starts. Depending on how cold it is, it'll either freeze over or it'll get wet. One of which is a problem. Yeah, so, very, very nice, tidy looking dry ice setup right there. And then the Core i3, well, it's like the 2120, it's a locked CPU. So these are very difficult to push because it's all about maxing out the BCLK. So this thing's running 110 megahertz BCLK, and then SuperPi 32 million, it's single threaded. I'm surprised he didn't kill hyperthreading. Like I'm not like the having all two cores enabled, that makes sense. But the hyperthreading really doesn't make sense because generally hyperthreading will reduce your single-threaded performance, and SuperPi will actually pick up on that pretty consistently in my experience. But yeah, so I'm surprised that he's running it with 2 cores and 4 threads. But the thing is, this benchmark, especially on a locked CPU like this, becomes basically a test of like, there's obviously some overclocking you can do with the BCLK, but then it's a test of, like, how low can you push like, how far can you push the memory, or more like, how low can you push the memory timings, because this is Sandy Bridge. So not only is this thing locked, the memory like, it doesn't clock memory very high. The Sandy Bridge memory controller is kind of a low, like, it's actually kind of worse than a lot of the X58 memory controllers in terms of, like, frequency capabilities, which is kind of weird that, like, it's a newer CPU and it doesn't clock the memory as high. Yeah, so running, what is that, like 2340 on the memory, or yeah, 2340 on the memory with 796 181T timings. So that is going to be, wait, is that quad rank? Oh, also looks like quad rank memory. I'm pretty sure that's got to be quad rank, right? Oh, and I think he's also repurposing Dominator heat spreaders. Yeah, that's... So, fun fact, those Dominator GT heat spreaders actually have, like, the way those heat spreaders are designed, they actually work well with, like, there's a bunch of LN2 pots that'll actually mount directly to those heat spreaders. So if you have a bunch of bad Dominators, you can, like, rip the heat spreaders off of them and use them for LN2 pot mounting to other memory sticks, which is what I'm assuming Crazy is doing right here. Because apparently these are G-Skill Tridents that he's running, but they definitely don't look like that in the system here. And yeah, and then other than just, having to run the memory at the very limits of what's possible in terms of timings for the limited frequency range that Sandy Bridge gives you, you also need to get your operating system really dialed in. And so this is of course Windows XP running on the olive green theme, which I've been told makes SuperPi 32 million run faster. I've not verified that myself. I'm not a big fan of SuperPi 32 million. It's too long, especially like when it runs like 8 minutes and 45 seconds. It's way too long, but yeah, apparently that does make that benchmark run faster. And, well, Crazy 85 here is the fastest to ever run this benchmark on a Core i3 2120, and there's a surprising number of people who thought that was a good idea. With concerning amounts of commitment, because that's like a single stage phase change, single stage, water cooling, more single stage, more dry ice. Yeah, and you can really see how, like, the BCLK overclocking just makes this super difficult, and also just makes it really tight in terms of what kind of frequencies everybody's hitting. So it really ends up being about, like, dialing in your OS and your memory, because it's not like you're going to outclock your competition by 100 megahertz. Not like there's just not that much BCLK headroom in the Sandy Bridge CPUs, because on Sandy Bridge, if you change the BCLK, it overclocks the SATA ports, it overclocks the PCIe, it overclocks absolutely bloody everything, and especially the SATA gets upset. Like the rest of the platform tends to get very upset about that. So yeah, a very difficult, like, obscure and very difficult ranking to sort of be at the top of. So congratulations to Crazy 85 on that. Yeah, certainly a crazy way to run a Core i3 2120, fitting name right there. And let's move on to the next score, which is my own score. I managed to take the 3Dmark Firestrike top score for the Vega 64. This is before all of the modification. Well, no, this is with EVC2 control, but I was only pushing like 10 millivolts extra. Anyway, and I was on the blower heatsink. Really, this isn't so much about my ability to overclock Vegas as it is about the fact that that is a 5950X and it just spits out such a massive physics score. Though I have managed to push the card a little bit further since this score, but I've just not bothered to update it because I have better plans for the Vega 64 here, and hopefully I'll get around to doing them soon. Because the air cooler, like, it's just like, I finally have voltage control. I want to take it cold. But yeah, so basically, I've managed to cheese my way to the top of the 3Dmark Firestrike rankings for the Vega 64 using my 5950X. Yeah, like, in my defense, the next guy in second place is using a 7980XE. Which goes to show you how incredibly overpowered the 5950X is. I'm getting like, what is it? 8,000 points more? Yeah. Okay, no, more like 7,000 points more. Yeah, anyway, so, like, I couldn't get any of the other rankings because it really is just like that 5950X inflating the overall score there. Though in the future, I would like to put, like, I do plan, like, I want to break, like, I do want to push the card a lot further in the future. So this is a placeholder for now because I personally don't like it, when you do, like, it's a GPU benchmark, overclock the damn GPU, not, like, don't have the 5950X drag your bad GPU overclock to the top of the rankings. But for now, this is where it's at. So anyway, I'm not going to congratulate myself on that. So let's move on to the next score, which is Chipsy's 3Dmark Firestrike Ultra. With a 6900 XT. So this is straight up, like, the thing is, the Firestrike Ultra no longer gets global points, but this is the fastest 6900 XT score in Firestrike Ultra. I'm in second place by 12 points. And he, like, this one I would debate is also, like, a case of his CPU being faster than my CPU. Because he's getting 18,902 GPU score, 45,000 points on the CPU, and 9,251 points in combined. My score, I'm getting ever so slightly more GPU. Yeah, I'm getting ever so slightly more points in the GPU test, significantly less physics, and ever so slightly less combined. But I'm on air cooling. And, well, once I could take the card, like, I've got big plans for the 6900 XT too. So, like, I'm kind of done with it until I get better, like, until I get coolant. Probably liquid nitrogen for both the Vega and the 6900 XT. I think I'll use the Vega as warm up and then do the 6900 XT. Because at least if I screw up on the Vega, I won't feel bad about it. Or at least won't feel too bad about it. Anyway, yeah, so Gypsy here, like, card on water cooling, that's a OC formula, and, I mean, like, you can do this kind of you can almost do these clocks on air cooling. I speak from experience. But, yeah, 5.2 like, almost 5.2 gigahertz on the 5950X, because that's on single stage phase change. And then just, yeah, so top score in the Firestrike Ultra rankings right now with, like, well, just in general, but you only get points for it based on how many 6900 XTs have run. So anyway, let's move on to the next score, and this is a weird one because this is Alex at Lyons 3Dmark 03 on the S3 Unichrome Pro. And you might be like, what the hell is a Unichrome Pro? Apparently, it's a graphics card made by VIA, which is a company that made, like, they made chipsets. I don't know if they made CPUs, but I do know they definitely made chipsets. And those chipsets came with integrated graphics. That's right. Back in the day, your iGPU, it didn't live in the CPU, it lived in the chipset, mostly because the memory controller also lived in the chipset. It didn't live in the CPU. Or at least I don't, yeah, not for what is this? This is LGA 775. Man, LGA 775 seems to be like the socket of like all of the weird like, if it's old and weird, it's probably LGA 775, assuming it's from Intel and not AMD. This socket has just so much variety in terms of like stuff that stuff that runs on 775. There's insane amounts of variety. But yeah, so this got into this roundup because it's like I've never heard of this. An S3 Unichrome Pro. Yeah, an iGPU. GPU-Z obviously is just as confused about this as I am. Like, well, actually, it knows what it's called, but like no frequency readout, no anything. I have no idea what goes into overclocking this. As far like it seems to be that actually it seems to be just like an OS thing or maybe memory. It's probably memory settings. Like it's an iGPU, so I can only assume that it's memory limited because that tends to be the number one bottleneck of every iGPU ever made. Yeah, and Alex did manage to clock the memory quite a lot higher than the previous top score for this GPU. So I'm gonna go with yeah. That's just like it's basically a memory benchmark because iGPUs rely on your RAM. So you just need more RAM bandwidth, and there's only one way to get that: more speed. So yeah, congratulations to Alex at Lion on the 3Dmark 3 top score with the Unichrome Pro, a thing that I didn't even know was a graphics card until I was looking through scores to include in this week's roundup. In this roundup. So anyway, next score we've got Obi-Wan 83's Super Pi 1M on the Pentium 2 400 megahertz. So this is another one of those like CPUs that plugs into a slot instead of a socket. So it makes attaching phase change cooling to it very awkward, as you can see right here, because it has to come in at an angle and like clear the memory stick. Well, the memory stick. I'm guessing there was only single. This has to be single channel, right? It doesn't even have channels. Like CPU-Z doesn't even read out how many channels this has. Oh man, old hardware. Yeah, this is on SDRAM, so this isn't even double data rate as far as I'm aware. And it just runs like super low timings, but it's also incredibly low clock speed, so not very fast. 600, like massive, like pretty massive overclock on the CPU, right? That's 58% over stock. And then Super Pi 1M, which is a benchmark that if you run this on modern hardware, you should expect it to finish in under 10 seconds. Yeah, on this, it runs 2 minutes and 57 seconds, which is actually the main reason that Super Pi 1M is actually like, was a benchmark for such a long time, was like, when like HWbot has been around in one form or another for a very long time. And so Super Pi 1M, like when HWbot started, like this was a long benchmark because this wasn't something that finishes in 10 seconds. Yeah, so Obi-Wan 83 here has managed to take the top score in Super Pi 1M with the Pentium 2 400 megahertz using single stage phase change and some SDRAM doing settings that I don't know if they're good or if they're bad, but they are evidently fast, or at least the CPU is fast. Like something here is fast because this benchmark is, single threaded and it loves memory performance, but I don't know anything about hardware this old. So yeah, I wish I could give you more details, but I just really can't because this is like what? I don't even know what years this stuff came out in. So anyway, so congratulations to Obi-Wan 83 on that, and let's move on to the next score, which is Gunzy's Geekbench 3 single core top score with the Ryzen 7 1700 at 4.548 gigahertz. That is the most awkward way I could have said that frequency readout. Why didn't I just read it? Like, it says megahertz right there. Anyway, running on a B550 Aorus Elite motherboard on dry ice. And man, Ryzen first gens, like, earlier in the video, I've mentioned how Ryzen's memory, like modern Ryzen chips, their memory controller gets kind of weird when it's cold. Well, first gen Ryzen, like look at those memory settings. Now, evidently, Gunzi decided to try offset the frequency issues with just more ranks, because that's 32 gigs of Samsung B dice. So that's running in dual rank. But yeah, that's DDR4 2500 10 10 10 24, because first gen Ryzen's memory controller is a potato when you take it cold. Like, it really doesn't work properly. What I'm really surprised by is that they're running 8 cores and all 16 threads enabled, even though they're like competing in the single core category. I would really expect that like disabling some cores and especially disabling the SMT would actually help the single core score. And also with Geekbench, with this category of Geekbench benching, like the way this works is like the score that counts towards the ranking is the single core score, but you do still have to run the multi-core test. So like you can't run settings that will crash in the multi-core part of the test. So running less cores, making the CPU therefore run less hot, I would assume would lead to the ability to run higher frequencies for the single core part of the test. Though at the same time, I'm not sure if Ryzen first gen doesn't have some weird thing where if you start disabling SMT and cores on Sub-Zero, it starts complaining about that again. Because it might. First gen Ryzen on Sub-Zero is very, very unpleasant. Very, very difficult to work with. Um, so yeah, second gen is great though. Like 2700X, super easy. Super easy if you have a good motherboard. First gen, on the other hand, is just horrendous as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, so very, very impressed. Like, cool score from Gunzi here on the dry ice cooling with that Ryzen 1700. I'm surprised they didn't manage to push the memory settings lower, but at the same time, like, there's a decent, like, the memory timings lower, because BDI is actually capable of lower memory timings at those kinds of frequencies. The thing is, the memory controller might not even allow you to do that. Like, when the memory controller just is very upset about anything, it manifests as both, like, you can't clock very high, but a lot of the time you also can't lower the timings as low as you would otherwise be able to go, so... yeah, this is a fiddly setup to run, and a very solid score. Like, they managed to take first place in the single core Geekbench 3 rankings for the Ryzen 7 1700. So congratulations to them on that, and let's move on to the next score, which is Kubi's GPU Pi version 3.3 1 billion score on a RX 580 that is absolutely flying at 1920 on the core and stock clocks on the memory, because GPU Pi is a very interesting benchmark. This is a OpenCL compute benchmark, and it basically doesn't care about memory settings on your GPU at all. The other interesting thing about it is because it's an OpenCL compute benchmark, it doesn't actually use all of the GPUs, like the graphics stuff in your graphics card. It doesn't really use it. The end result of that is that you can run absolutely insane core clocks in this benchmark relative to basically everything else, and also it's short, right? Like here it only takes 20 seconds, and on higher end GPUs it finishes in, well, even less time than that. But yeah, so it really, like, this is sort of a, like, this is almost the, like, CPU-Z validation of GPU benchmarks, because if you're going to see a high clock speed for a GPU benchmark, it's in this. Nothing else is as light as GPU Pi is. Also, it doesn't care about memory speed. In fact, I'm surprised that, like, Kubi's didn't try underclocking the graphics card to maybe get even a bit more core clock out of it, because that can sometimes help. Just underclocking the memory can give you a little bit more core stability. But evidently wasn't necessary, as he's taken first place in this ranking by with an over 1 second advantage over the previous score. And here's the actual setup. His LN2 pot's a bit short. It's like that's a Kingpin Cooling Tech 9, and it's missing the top extension, which I wonder what happened to that. Because yeah, normally there's like an aluminum extension on top of that. Not that you would need it on an RX 580, because I don't believe these go I don't believe you can really run these at full pot properly. Yeah, and then you can see some, like, I'm assuming that's going to be eraser for insulation on the back. And though the lack of, like, the seeming lack of insulation on the front is kind of concerning to look at. Oh yeah. Also, this is an like RX 580 4 gig card, which is like why the memory why the memory comes at 1750. That's actually stock memory clock. Like for 8 gig cards, the stock memory clock is 2 GHz, but for 4 gig cards, it's 1750 megahertz. So like this says it's underclocked, but it's actually not. That's the stock clock speed for the 4 gig cards. Anyway, so congratulations to Kubies on taking first place in the RX 580 GPU Pi 1 billion rankings. Let's move on to the last score, which is TSA's 3Dmark Vantage Performance, top score for the RX Vega 56 at 1735 on the core and 1080 on the memory. So that's got to be running well, it can't be running a Vega 56 BIOS, or he's got an HBM voltage control some other way, because the thing about the Vega 56 is the BIOS that the Vega 56 comes with 1.2 volts memory voltage, whereas the Vega 64 comes with 1.35 volts memory voltage. The end result of that voltage difference is that Vega 64s can clock the memory significantly higher than Vega 56s, as the HBM does scale with memory voltage. However, the thing with Vega 56s is you can get Vega 56s with both Samsung and Hynix memory, and apparently the Hynix memory dies if you feed it 1.35 volts for long enough, so you wouldn't actually want to put a 64 BIOS onto a Hynix card. Also, I believe the 64 BIOS might not even run on Hynix cards at all, because it only supports Samsung memory. So it'll be interesting. Yeah, so the Samsung memory, but has to be running I'm assuming he has to be running a Vega 64 BIOS. Yeah, 5900X, and he should really disable his hyper SMT for that, because 3Dmark Vantage is an relatively old benchmark, and it just has no idea what to do when it sees more than 16 threads, and you start losing performance because of that. So for 3Dmark Vantage, if your CPU has 12 cores, just disable any kind of multi-threading. If it has 14 cores, disable multi-threading. If it has 16 cores, disable multi-threading. If it has 18 cores, disable multi-threading, potentially consider disabling some cores as well. If you have 24 cores, you have to disable the extra cores. Like, if you've got 32 cores, you've got to disable the extra cores, because it slows down the more cores. Like, if there's more cores than what Vantage knows what to do with, it will slow down a lot. So, yeah, running it with 12 cores and 24 threads is not optimal. Also, by disabling SMT, you can often gain a little bit more core clock, which would further help increase the CPU score, but just disabling SMT will boost your CPU score on its own. So, yeah, but 5900X, and this setup is just like a lovely mix of like weirdly cost-effective hardware. I mean, with the exception of the X470 Aorus Gaming 7, that's a top-of-the-line X470 motherboard. But, you know, like this right here, this is Micron Rev E memory, dual rank Micron Rev E. So, like, you know, the really pushing the performance per dollar limits right there, running 15, 20, 17 on the timing. So, you know, tuned the memory quite well. He got 1T command rate running without gear down mode. That's impressive. That's like proper 1T, because he's running cast latency 15. So what? Damn. Anyways, 1866, so 3733 on the memory. Yeah, so that is quite the memory settings right there. That almost looks dailyable. It might actually be daily memory settings for this setup, which would just kind of be neat. And then of course you have the Vega 56, which was, well, just there was a period of time where you could get a Vega 56 for like a really good price, and then if you threw a Vega 64 BIOS on it, assuming that it came with Samsung memory, you basically had a Vega 64 in terms of performance. So yeah, this is like I would consider this is a very cost-effective build in a way. It's also a horrible mess of cables, but hey, it's fast. No, like, you don't, like, who cares about what it looks like? It's fast. It's very fast in Vantage. So yeah, congratulations to TSA on the 3Dmark Vantage Performance top score with the Vega 56. And that is it for this week's, or more like this was supposed to come out on Sunday. What day is it today? I have no idea. It is Thursday. Damn, it's late. Yeah, so this was supposed to come out on Sunday. It's now Thursday, but Yeah, so like there, HWbot score roundup number 8. We like world records. Actually, 2 world records, which is like that's relatively rare. Unless there's like a big hardware launch, that's relatively rare. Um, then some weird category top scores, some very old, like some old top scores for various pieces of hardware, some just weird scores in general, right, with the Unichrome Pro. So, yeah, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comments section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the AHOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, stickers, posters, the usual YouTuber merch. There's a link to that down in the description below as well. Both the Patreon and Teespring help out immensely with running the channel, so it would be much appreciated if you check them out. And that's it for the video, so thank you for watching, and goodbye.